Welcome to the Cyber Talent series, where we explore how organizations are closing skills gap, accelerating onboarding, and building high-performance cybersecurity teams. My name is Phoebe DeVito. I'm joined by Thomas Rogers, and we are talking with Dustin Lehr, application security advocate at Security Journey, co-founder of Katilyst and AppSec Consultant. So welcome, Dustin.
Yeah, it's great to be here. This is going to be fun.
Awesome. Well, Dustin, to get started, could you tell us a little bit more about yourself and what you're doing now?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was a software engineer for over a decade, wrote a lot of code, was very sort of heads down, the engineer type, leave me alone. I'm trying to code. I'm trying to debug. Do you want me to fix the problem or do you want me to talk to you about it? Right, was sort of my mindset. And then I was also very interested in getting sort of the quality side and the process side of software engineering right in all the companies and all the teams that I worked at. So it was sort of a natural segue to go from what I was doing there into application security, which is all about quality, right? And I tend to think about AppSec as a quality focus, with security just being a large portion of that. So I was a security architect for a little while, and then I've led AppSec teams at multiple companies, large and small, Staples, Fivetran. And now I do a lot of various things. So I do a lot of AppSec consulting work. I work, like you mentioned, as an advocate, which is a very sort of public facing field type of role. I do a lot of speaking at events, keynotes, things like this. So I'm just kind of out there, sharing my thoughts. I do a lot of thought leadership articles and so forth. And then I co-founded a company, Katilyst, and we focus on helping people with security culture change and security champion programs. So yeah, I do a lot of various things, but they're all related, at least in terms of software quality, developer advocacy and so forth.
Awesome. Yeah. One of the interesting perspectives, because we hear a lot of people with like non-traditional backgrounds in cyber, and I'm sure you get asked this a lot, and having been like a people manager at various stops throughout your career, like, hey, Dustin, what's the best way to like get into cyber? What's the best path? I feel like people who understand programming and computers in some capacity in early career roles, that's generally like what we hear as a great path. What's your perspective on like how to best position yourself as an early career person, like trying to get into cyber?
Yeah, I would definitely give the advice to learn the hard stuff, especially when you're early in your career. Really bite off, because you have time, in theory, depth of knowledge. Learn the ins and outs of software. I do think you should follow your interest, though. Don't learn things that you're just not interested in, but certainly cyber is a very broad space and technology is very broad in general, right? Like you could go learn about cloud, you could learn about network information, you could learn about software, hardware, right? There's a lot of places to go. And I think while you're early in your career is the best time to just go deep. I mentioned before, I sort of got involved in the quality side and sort of the process side. I've been thinking about this a lot. I started to see some things that I thought could be improved with the software engineering process in general. But I think what I did early in my career is I focused on that too much. Okay. I was very interested in it, but I do think I missed out a little bit on the depth that I could have gone into, especially when I was very early. Now, I corrected that, and I did end up saying, okay, like I mentioned before, I became sort of the leave me alone, I'm focusing type. And I think that actually helped me a lot, because it helped me go really deep. To sort of sum it up, I would say, well, you have time. Yeah, just focus on going deep, because that's going to serve you well later down the line.
What you just said sparked something, because I think it's so interesting. Security in general, like you could have easily probably just stayed a software developer, and it's a very lucrative career, and very probably interesting work that you could have done. Did you have a moment that broke you out of that, like heads down coder, like, okay, like some of this other stuff matters too?
Yeah, I mean, what I was sharing before really stems from the fact that I wanted to build high quality software, right? And I met a lot of folks along the way. I think there are different types of software engineers. Some are very focused on speed or prototyping, right? Like very much writing code as quickly as possible. I think others are a little bit more concerned with writing high quality code, right? It's maintainable, it's performant, it's secure. And there's sort of these higher level concepts that you concern yourself with. I was always the one as a developer who's like, are we doing this right? Can we rewrite this so that it's easier to maintain in the future? And I just kept bringing that over and over. And when I was thinking about, I had a position in front of me. It was from a friend who was leading an AppSec team. This was back at Staples, invited me to join. And I was like, I don't know, maybe I kind of enjoy software engineering. Like, why would I get involved in such things? And then I had another friend who was friends with both of us. And he said, this is right up your alley because you always talk about this stuff. You always talk about quality. You always talk about doing it right. This is an opportunity to do this more at scale, right? Help several teams as an AppSec architect implement these types of things. And I was like, okay. So I sort of just trusted my wiser and older friend, older in their career, by the way. It's never an age thing, right? Wiser friend who just gave me that nudge. Go get involved because this is right up your alley. And they knew me well enough that I did make that decision. And I loved every minute of it. And I've loved every minute of it since. I really felt like everything came together when I became an AppSec engineer and then an AppSec leader that just took all these various things that I cared about and combined them all. And then I just sort of came alive, and I think I've met a lot of people since who sort of found that spark a lot earlier in their career. Kudos, to folks who have been able to do that. For me, it didn't happen for a long time. We're talking, 13 years before I really felt like I found what I was meant to do.
That's awesome. I mean, it's awesome that you were able to find that. Even, 13 years into your career feels like a long time when you're young, but then later in your career, you'll look back and be like, hey, that was just the start of it. So you decided to become like a people manager. I'm sure you could have also stayed in that like individual contributor role for a while. And it sounds like you kind of had some like natural, you're asking a lot of questions about like quality and like, is this the best way to do it? That probably was like some indication that you would have been a good leader. But like what made you feel good about making that jump? Did it feel natural or was it a tough decision?
It was a very tough decision. Like we were talking about, I very much enjoyed going deep, right? And being detail oriented and knowing all about the system. I felt like I couldn't even learn something unless I was able to spend the time with it to really understand the ins and outs. It happened quickly. So I was actually an application architect at the time. This was the opportunity at Staples that my wiser friend recommended I get involved in. I was an application architect when I joined the team, but I was only in that position for about 4 months. And what had happened was what I described before. All of my pursuits in the past and the messages and the things that I was trying to change in the teams that I was working for, et cetera, it all came together to the point that he was actually filling in for the CISO at the time, but he recognized that I was very passionate about this. Like I was learning about AppSec, but I was bringing all these other perspectives and I was like trying to influence even my manager at the time to take a certain approach with the rest of the organization and so forth. And the person who saw all of that decided that I would be best to just jump in and lead the entire AppSec effort. And I was like, whoa. So it was completely unexpected. Looking back on it, I can see now why a leader would pick someone like me out, because they'd be like, you seem to be passionate about this, but also have a lot of the answers that we're looking for. But at the time I was like, yeah, but I'm brand new as an AppSec architect here and I want to stay technical. So I ended up taking a couple of weeks. I was like, let me think about it. I think a lot of people will jump straight on that opportunity, right? Oh, cool. The next rung on the ladder, let's go, let's do this. For me, I was like, what am I going to be leaving behind? I was sharing before, I didn't feel like I could even understand something unless I could spend the time to go deep on it. I would be giving that up. And I realized the gravity of that situation. I reached out to several people who were sort of mentors at the time. And I was like, should I do this? It got to the point where the person who wanted to put me in that position had to reach out again. Are you interested? Like, what's going on? And eventually what I decided is that it was the perfect combination, right, of all the skills that I had built so far. And I wanted to make the sacrifice essentially for the team, because I was a peer, right? I had to tell myself, like, there's a lot of things that we need to get right as a team. And I will make the sacrifice to sort of jump up into that position and cover a lot of the things that we need to cover, so the rest of the people on the team can focus on the things that they need to focus on. And I remember very clearly that was why I made the decision. I think since then, I've learned a lot around how to stay technical in a lot of ways without going deep. You know, there's a lot of things that you can learn by proxy. But yeah, that was kind of the nature of how that went down.
No, that's great. So we're piecing together your career now from like software developer who, was off in your own world doing the work you wanted to do, showing some other interest, into taking this leap into like a different role and immediately having a even bigger shift in front of you. So now people management is something we are, really interested in talking about, especially, on this podcast and like what we do. Love to hear how that transition went for you. Like what kind of surprises were there, difficult things? I'm sure you probably pulled from a lot of your own individual experiences, like how were you managed in the past and like how you wanted to enable others. So yeah, I would love to hear how that initial stretch went.
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly right. So I was the type who was taking notes all along the way, right? Like there were certain instances where I'm reporting to someone else and I'm like, well, that's annoying. Or, you probably heard this a lot. I think the stereotype is true in terms of a sort of skeptical, almost cynical, although I don't like that term, engineer, right? Who's kind of not happy with the way that things are being managed and so forth. That was absolutely me. But I took a much more positive approach, because what I would do is I would obviously stay positive, but just take a note. Like, I don't like the way the manager handled that, so I'm going to take a note, right? And I think, long story short, I took all of that with me as a leader, and I saw it as an opportunity to correct everything that annoyed me about the leaders that I had had in the past. So that was really an opportunity that I embraced. The interesting part, though, is I also recognized the things that I had done as a report that were not helpful to a leader, right? Like I would observe behaviors in my reports that I used to do. And I would say, oh, that's what it's like to be in the leadership position and have my report act like that. Darn, that's what I used to do. Okay, so in a large respect, I became a much better report. So that was directly applicable, because while I'm a leader of others, I'm also reporting to someone else. A few other things that I would share. I had to learn this concept of extreme ownership, which I actually just read this book recently and thought it was great. But a lot of the concepts in the book directly applied to my own experience as well, because what I had to learn is that as a leader, you are accountable for the work of your team. Period. You cannot say, well, I asked them to do this, they didn't do it right, so it's their fault. I think the most effective leaders take ownership and accountability for what their team does, and they recognize to what extent they have influence over that work. Okay, maybe something wasn't communicated properly. Maybe the requirements weren't set up in a way that the folks on your team understood. Or maybe you hired the wrong person for your team, but you have to then take accountability that you brought this person on your team, or you let them stay, or whatever it is. But it does come down to you taking that personal ownership and taking action to correct it so that your team is able to perform. And that should absolutely come down to the way that you're being perceived by the rest of the org as someone who delivers or doesn't, right? Without excuses.
The first part you just talked through really reminded me of just like being a parent. Yeah, I think growing up thinking about like, oh, I maybe wouldn't have handled it that way as a parent. Now I've got 3 kids. I know you do too. And like I have all the notes of like, this is how I want to be as a parent. I'm sure my kids are probably accumulating their own lists of how they're going to do things differently. But I feel like looking back at like prior managers, you're like, oh, like I'm going to do things way differently. And then once you're in that role, you also kind of see like why they did things the way they did.
Oh, yeah. What is the quote? It's amazing how much my parents learned between when I was 18 and 23. Have you heard this before? It's kind of like that, like you have this higher level of respect for what your parents did for you, because now that you're a parent, you're like, oh, geez, okay, this is a lot harder. And now I understand what they were going through. I think it's the same as a leader. I think you get in that role and you're like, oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Now I get it. Whoops. So that was a very humbling experience for me. I think the other thing I'll touch on, if you'll allow me, is there's a lot of debate, I think, to what extent a leader should stay technical. And I would love to just touch on this, because I have found, especially as a technical person who's very, very curious, who enjoys being technical, that it's been my experience, if I spend too much time in the technical details, it does my team a disservice, straight up. There are other things that I need to be doing to empower my team, to influence others across the organization, et cetera, to communicate with my team, but also with others, to sort of clear blockers and clear paths and make sure that my team can be as productive as possible so they can focus on the technical details. That has been huge. Now, that doesn't mean don't spend any time on it. Like, certainly I spend some time getting familiar with some of the new concepts, AI and how to use AI and all that. That's been very much a focus of my own research. But I certainly think you can go too far if you're trying to stay technical. And I like to mention that I am not technical anymore in order to help frame that correctly. No, I'm a leader, not a technical resource at this point. Although I do think once you have been technical, you have a baseline, like you have things that will never go away, right? We've got engineers working on our product at Katilyst, and there have been several instances where I'm not touching the code. I want to leave that to them, but they're bringing up things and I can visualize exactly what they're talking about, to the point that I can even offer advice. And they're kind of like, how did you know that, in a lot of cases, So that's a lot of value that I think you can bring as a manager, and that you should focus on bringing.
Yeah, you're like sort of operationalizing the management side of things, where maybe you can like kind of anticipate like where problems might be. Even if they handed you the keys, you might not be able to fix it anymore, but you know where to look.
Exactly. And that's been part of that experience. Like, they're in the middle of troubleshooting something and they're like, we're kind of stuck right here. We're still working through it. Don't worry. And I'm kind of like, have you thought about this? And they're like, oh, no. And it turns out that's where it is, right? Because I have this intuition that came with, again, going deep for many years, which is why what I was saying at the beginning is very important, right? Like, you have to build that baseline, that foundation of knowledge that will continue to benefit you far into the future, even when you're not technical anymore and you're more of a leader.
Yeah, makes total sense. Okay, so I think we've pretty much like pieced together your career. So you mentioned, it's been a couple years since you left Fivetran. And you mentioned, basically staying up to date with trends and remaining technical adjacent. I mean, how much has changed like AI wise since you left Fivetran? It's like pretty crazy. But I'm curious, when you sort of reflect back to like, now you're in more of a startup environment, founder, and helping, Security Journey being more of like a startup size company. Fivetran, obviously like over 1,000 people, big security team, a couple hundred people in the Security Champions program. Like, how do you think about AI, like from a managerial perspective, like at the bigger company and then at the startup?
Oh, there's a lot to talk about there. AI, how it applies to startups, how it applies to larger companies. I think AI should be considered the next trend in tech, which I think if you're around long enough, you sort of see these trends come up and down. Like, is AI going to change everything? I think, sure, to the extent that a lot of the other technologies that we've seen have changed everything, right? I do think it's sort of that next generation of technology that's going to bring us to the next level. The way that I think it applies in terms of code and building software is I think it's going to more and more look like this fourth generation language on top of the other generations of language that we've seen. This is in the future, not now. Let's be clear about that. You don't necessarily have to concern yourself with the level of detail that you used to, right? So let me make it a concrete example. You've got machine code, you've got assembly code, you've got third generation languages like C, C++. You can just write code on the C, C++ level. I do think this is that next level of abstraction. Now, are we there yet where we can completely trust that the fourth generation AI generated code is going to build quality code like you'd be able to build yourself? Not yet. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done to get us there. But I'm hopeful, and I do think that we're going to get there eventually if we put the right specialists on it as well. So that's kind of my general view of AI. I think in terms of how this applies to smaller companies versus large companies, I really would like to see a little more, how do I say this and not offend everyone? I think I'm going to offend some people no matter what I say, but I think there's an over-indexing on it. I think it's been an extreme, hey, cool, AI is here. We can just get rid of half of our engineers, right? And have AI do some stuff, to very quickly realize that that's not necessarily going to work. And I've heard stories of larger companies making these very rash decisions when it comes to that. I think that certainly applies to startups too, but in a slightly different way, right? Like the large companies are thinking about it in terms of their workforce, and they're at a different level of expectation, right? To create a stable environment. Whereas startups, it's a lot more fluid, right? Like they can pivot, they can make different decisions. So I think in startup land, it looks a lot more like pivoting their entire product or entire strategy based on AI to maybe realize that AI is over promised right now. Right. So I think we're going to see that churn happen over the next few years where investments have been made in certain areas of AI and what it can do that just don't come to fruition. So many of those startups will fail. And I think the ones who are being reasonable in terms of the capabilities, what it can do versus not, are going to be the ones that stick around. So those are some of my thoughts. Certainly probably a lot more to unpack there, but
very rational take. Yeah, it's good.
That's awesome. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. And as we know from the intro, you wear a lot of hats. You're an advocate, and you're also a consultant and an entrepreneur. So we would love to just hear kind of the quick spiel on Katilyst, and I think that'll spark a really interesting conversation about just security champion programs and stuff like that.
Yeah, certainly. I think the folks who are in the best position to start a company are ones who have gone through the actual challenge themselves, right? That they're trying to solve. Exactly what happened with Katilyst. And really where this stemmed from is when I was leading AppSec, it became really clear to me that this is beyond a technical challenge. This is a people and organization culture challenge that I'm facing, right? The tech is there. We have plenty of vulnerabilities. This is the way that I always frame it, right? We've got plenty of vulnerabilities. There's plenty of tools that can tell us the vulnerabilities. The problem is shifting the culture to actually change their behavior in a couple of ways that I can think of off the top of my head. One, to actually fix the vulnerabilities. How do you get people to go from here's a bunch of vulnerabilities to actually fixing them in a way that is repeatable and efficient and so forth? The other side of that is how do we prevent those vulnerabilities? Is there an appetite to change behavior when it comes to preventative measures to prevent those vulnerabilities from going live to begin with? So these are the problems that I'm trying to tackle in AppSec. And what became really clear to me is the more allies that I can engage across the organization, the more champions that I can recruit, whether formal or informal, the better. Because I'm going to have feedback from them. I'm going to have a stronger connection into the rest of the organization to actually get work done. So I really leaned into this whole champions concept. The other thing too, I remember this in the early days of us sitting around. I'm like a brand new AppSec manager. And we're sitting in a room and we're like, all right, here's all the things we need to accomplish. We look at threat modeling And we go, how are we going to do this? Well, the champions are going to help. Well, what about this? Who's going to help us with vulnerability management and triaging the issues? Champions. And we were like going down the list and we're like, okay, clearly the core to a lot of this is having champions across the organization. So I leaned into that, and then we created a champion program there at Staples that was successful. It exists to this day, I'm proud to say. But part of the challenge going through that is realizing that it's not as easy as it sounds to just recruit champions. There's an entire motivation and engagement piece that becomes really important. And I started to realize there aren't a lot of tools or resources out there to help me figure out how to keep the champions engaged beyond training. Training certainly has its place, but you want to go from training to action. How do I get folks to take action? So that's really where Katilyst was born. And I actually had met someone, my co-founder, Stanley Harris, at Staples, and we just began to jive on this concept of how champions are essential to culture change. And that's really where Katilyst came from. So we do a handful of things, if I may share. 4 things. We help design culture change programs through champions. We help with live event hosting. So we actually bring folks in to host these sort of community meetings that are typical with security champion programs. We actually help with community management. So the engagement piece, having a real live person there to engage with others across the organization. And then we also have a product, and the product helps to gamify the entire experience. Okay, so if you have a leveling system, or some sort of badging system or something that you've designed, we essentially support that with our product. So you can customize it, you can sort of create your own custom levels. And then we have integrations that pull in the actual actions that people take so that we can reward folks properly. But that's what we're doing, and that's where Katilyst came from.
That's awesome. No, you hit on a bunch of stuff that we'll maybe want to dive deeper into. One question I have is, what are like some signs and symptoms that leadership should look out for that might signal to them that they're in need of either some enhancements to their security and champions team, or kind of a new program that doesn't already exist?
Yeah, and I think this comes down to that engagement piece that I was expressing before. I think when you first set up a champions program, maybe some of the expectation is we now have a place for people to show up and engage. And then I think you're very quickly going to realize people aren't just going to show up and engage magically. Like, hey, we put everyone in a Slack channel so that they could talk, but no one's talking. How come no one's talking, right? And I think those are some of the signs that maybe you need to step back a little bit and say, okay, how do we actually create a fully immersive and motivational experience for folks where they're actually incentivized to get involved? And that's really what makes the difference. The other thing that I would mention is not having a clear vision or set of goals for your champion program is where I think a lot of people get stuck too, because they're like, we have a champion program, everyone is part of a community. Okay, but what are you trying to accomplish? Right? Like it's one thing to say we can all be part of a fun club here. It's something else to say, especially with leadership looking at this, that this is providing real tangible value. And I think from day one, you need to be very clear with what is the value that this program is eventually going to bring and be constantly working toward that. In terms of signs for whether you may need a champion program, I would say there is a lack of clear communication or set of allies across your organization that are helping you get work done. If you're unable to get a hold of folks, if people don't know who you are, they don't ever reach out to the security team, you're kind of sitting there waiting, no one ever needs anything, that can indicate that you just have not placed yourself into the environment in a way that's effective. And that's really where I think this champion concept shines, because it creates those relationships that you can then get work done through. So those are some initial thoughts there.
Who's the right person you think to like own this program? And then I guess as a back end of that, I would assume it's like some sort of security manager at some level. But yeah, could you just talk about what that does for a security, team manager? Like how does that How does that help them do their job better, having the program in place?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I've been thinking about this a lot because I do get asked this, where does your champion program fit into the rest of your program in terms of priority? And I always come back with, it is your program. Like, you will not accomplish what you're looking to accomplish from an AppSec perspective and even from a cybersecurity perspective unless you have an effective method of identifying allies and working with them to get stuff done across your environment. So I do think it is a leader's position. That could be a CISO. That could be, the director of AppSec. It could be the single AppSec engineer that's at a smaller company, recognizing that this form of connecting with folks and relationship building is absolutely foundational and essential to get anything done when it comes to AppSec or cyber.
Reminds me a lot of like Phoenix Project and just basically fitting, the security program, as a business enabler. Like, how does that help, make the business do the things that it's supposed to do, not the other way around?
Yeah, by integrating. That's exactly right. And that's one of my favorite books, by the way. And the Unicorn Project is fantastic. But yeah, not as a separate thing. We do a lot of things over here that are good for the business. And then we have the security team and they just sort of sit over here and do other things. That's not the way to do it. You, as a security leader, it's your job to integrate yourself into what provides business value at the end of the day. And I think it's the same with your champion program. Like I do see a lot of folks say, okay, we've got our AppSec strategy. It's going well over here. And then we have this little fun club security champion program over here. And they don't, neither the two shall meet. Not the right way to do it. They need to be completely integrated, right? And part of the overall strategy for your AppSec program.
How does that play into like people management? And, you as a former, I guess current still people manager, just different scale, but like when you are, in the office of the CISO and you're managing your direct reports and they're telling you what their career goals are and like asking you how they can progress, how does your advice change? And how does the security champions angle play into, what advice you provide for direct reports?
Yeah, I mean, this is all about people development to some extent, or career development or skills development. Right. And it's all related, like you pointed out, because what you're doing with your security champions is you are listening to what interests them, and then you are providing direction and tools and guidance and so forth so that they can grow in that area. And I think it's the same with direct reports, right? Where you need to listen to what your direct reports need and are interested in. And then I always saw the leader's duty here as aligning their interests with the goals of your team and the goals of the company. In some cases, they're going to overlap completely. I want to learn more about threat modeling and be the threat modeling leader. Well, great, because we've got an entire threat modeling initiative that we want to roll out. So there you go. We match the two. Let's go. Now, in a lot of cases, sure, you're going to find instances where they're off. And this is why my fingers are like this. Some of them line up, some of them do not, right? So how do you sort of handle the cases where they don't line up? I think part of that is, hey, we just need to do some things, even though they're not part of what totally interests you. Look at it like a growth opportunity as well, I know that you really want to do this thing, but what we need to do right now for the good of the business and so forth is this. This is an opportunity, right? To sort of learn more about it, get more involved and so forth. And then if there's a gap on the other side, that could be a hiring opportunity or some sort of outsourcing opportunity, or even a shift in strategy if necessary.
That's awesome. And I think it's really cool thinking back on early in your own career. When you were talking about those pivot points, it seems like a lot of them came from feedback from someone else or someone, whether that's a peer or, a manager showing you an opportunity that maybe you hadn't considered or, weren't open to at that time. So I think it comes really full circle to think about now the impact you can have as a manager to point something out to someone that either because it's outside of their comfort zone or just, not something that they had thought about, or they're not, they don't have that same lens looking at the entire business strategy. So yeah, it's really encouraging. I think it kind of goes back to that message we were talking about earlier on in the episode as well.
Yeah, and I think it takes a lot of trust to be able to guide folks to that extent, especially folks who are later in their career who do feel like this is all I want to do, or I'm not comfortable learning something new, right? Or whatever that is. Like there's certainly a lot of challenges there. And I think it's your job as a leader to encourage that growth. This is a blind spot. Like as an example, as we've been talking about through this entire session, that it's very important to be able to engage with people and be able to influence people and help people and guide people. A lot of the engineers that I've hired haven't recognized that yet. I've had to sort of lead them to that because they wanted to very much stay, focused and stay technical. Now, we did talk about, is it the right time in their career? Like there's a lot of factors there, but I do think even folks who are later in their career have a lot of growth opportunities, even just a pivot, like you mentioned. It's a good word because with new technology like AI and so forth, there's always an opportunity to learn something new. And I think as a leader, you need to encourage that and provide tools and resources to make that easier.
Love it. So I've got one more question, then we'll wrap up. I know you have a lot of thoughts on gamification and using that as a vehicle to accomplish things that you want to accomplish in the business. I think the main question I have is just around like engagement. So like, Security Champions program, in particular, like they can get large. You can bring people in that have no security on the surface, no security responsibility or background. And so how do you keep them involved, engaged? What are your thoughts on gamification as an engagement, vehicle? And then specifically regarding the Security Champions program?
Yeah. So I think I'll start by just saying I don't even like the term gamification because I think it creates an image in people's heads that is over indexed on the gaming side of it. And for some, I think the knee jerk reaction is, we're professionals. We don't play games, right? What is this game thing? We don't have time for such things. But gamification is much deeper than that. And I think when I first started getting into it, I hadn't realized that either. It's about motivation. It's about learning what motivates folks and really leaning into that. And the reason it's called gamification is because a lot of these techniques for how to motivate people have been fully matured on the game side. What I love to say in this area is, why do people play games to begin with? Right? Like, does this bring them money? No. Okay, why do they constantly engage, right, on your mobile phone or whatever it is with these little addictive games that you might have? So what have they tapped into there in terms of secrets for how to motivate people? Why do you keep coming back? And I think that's where the term comes from. It's not about turning something into a game. It's about taking these techniques, the underlying motivators, understanding them, and then incorporating those into a non-game situation. You're actually trying to make it a non-game situation. So another example I always like to use here is leveling systems. Essentially, I don't know, think of a hardcore game, right? Where you're a character and the more monsters you kill or whatever, you're sort of able to level up. And as you level up to level 2 or 3 or whatever, you're gaining more skills, you have more abilities, whatever that is. How exactly is that different than leveling up at your company by getting promoted? It's the same. Okay, so everyone is doing gamification in a large respect by leaning into the recognition, the increase in responsibilities, everything that comes with a title increase, right? So I do think that these techniques can be extremely effective if you lean into the underlying motivators of humans. One of my favorite gamification world frameworks is when it comes to rewards, thinking outside the box. I think people think rewards and they go straight to money and gift cards. I love this concept of SAPs. So it stands for status, access, power, and stuff. And it's basically encouraging you to think beyond just stuff into things like status as a reward. If you could just label someone who took extra training and is a champion who has contributed quite a bit as a guru champion or a level 2 champion or whatever that is, and then you announce that publicly in a all hands or to their manager or whatever, that's going to mean a lot to them because they're going to feel like, oh, all of the efforts that I put into this have been recognized. And now I'm like, all right, well, how do I get to level 3? How do I continue down this path? Because I was actually incentivized and rewarded for the things that I have done. I think it's that simple. And in terms of applying it to a champion program, I think I gave this example already, making sure that they're being recognized for the contributions that they're making, not just, you're a really good champion, thanks, but you've earned the next level. Next all hands, we're announcing that your manager's going to know all about your contributions, and that is very motivating, again, for folks. So that's how I think you can take these concepts and apply it directly to your champion program.
That's awesome. Makes me want to do a whole episode on like the psychology of gamification. It's really, really interesting.
One thing I will leave both of you and the audience is I do have a book to recommend. It's called Actionable Gamification, and it's all about this framework that's called Octalysis that breaks a lot of this down. There's a lot of detail here in terms of the 8 core drives that motivate us as humans, and then even specific techniques that lend themselves to each of those core drives. So it's where a lot of my depth in this area has come from. So would highly recommend that.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing. We'll check that out for sure. Well, this has been so awesome, Dustin. Like Thomas said, I feel like we could talk for hours, but in the interest of time, we'll wrap up. And we have one question that we like to kind of end cap these episodes with. And you've talked a little bit about this throughout the episode, so feel free to harken back to anything you've said. But we like to ask folks, if you were starting your career in cyber now, what is one thing that you would tell yourself?
Yeah, I would go back to what I was sharing before, and that's go deep. Go deep when you're early in your career and you have time. Things change later. You're going to have a different set of responsibilities. People are going to look to you for different things. While you have time to concentrate, that is the time to really go deep and build that foundation of technical knowledge or knowledge in general. It doesn't even need to be technical, right? There are a lot of cyber fields that aren't technical, but learning the ins and outs of how to do that job really well, that's what I would recommend. And that's what I wish. Yeah, that's what I would say to myself as a younger cyber person.
That's awesome. Yeah, just adding on to that. Yeah, I'm thinking about even early on in my career when, you get that like anxiety because you look on your boss's calendar and they have like 800 meetings and you're like, oh, I feel like I should be doing more. And it can feel like this signal of I need to be there. Like, I feel like going back to the parenting analogy from the kid's perspective, it's like you always want to be older than you are and on to the next phase, but you can really easily miss how amazing that time that you have is at that level. And especially now, there's so many great resources out there. So it's really, really good advice and encouragement.
Well said. That is exactly right. I remember looking at my manager's calendar and being like, should mine look like that?
Right.
But I also might have over-indexed on getting there as quickly as possible versus, like you said, which was perfect, realizing that the empty calendar is an opportunity to really go deep. Absolutely.
Perfect. Well, I think that's a great note to end on. This has been so awesome, Dustin. Thank you again for your time.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Dustin. That's a wrap for today's episode of the Cyber Talent Series. If you enjoyed the combo, make sure to subscribe on Spotify. Also follow us on YouTube and subscribe there. We'll be sharing content there as well. For ongoing tips on hiring, retaining, upskilling your cyber workforce, make sure to follow us on LinkedIn and check us out at MetaCTF.com. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time.